"Mauclay, my dear fellow, you tell us nothing about your journey," said my friend Banks, the engineer, to me. "One would suppose you had never got beyond your native Paris. What do you think of India?" "Think of India?" I replied. "I really must see it before I can answer that question." "Well, that is good," returned Banks. "Why, you have just traversed the entire peninsula from Bombay to Calcutta, and unless you are downright blind—" "I am not blind, my dear Banks, but during that journey you speak of I was blinded." "Blinded?" "Yes, quite blinded, by smoke, steam, dust, and above all by the rapid motion. I don't want to speak evil of railroads, Banks, since it's your business to make them. But let me ask you whether you call it traveling to be jammed up in the compartment of a carriage, see no further than the glass of the windows on each side of you, tear along day and night, now over viaducts among the eagles and vultures, now through tunnels among moles and rats, stopping only at stations one exactly like another, seeing nothing of towns but the outside of their walls and the tops of their minarets. And all this amid an uproar of snorting engines, shrieking steam whistles, grinding and grating of rails, varied by the mournful groans of the brake. Can you, I say, call this traveling so as to see a country?"
"Well done," cried Captain Hood. "There, Banks, answer that if you can. What is your opinion, Colonel?"
The colonel, thus addressed, bent his head slightly and merely said, "I'm curious to know what reply Banks can make to our guest, Monsieur Mauclay." "I reply without the slightest hesitation," said the engineer, "that I quite agree with Mauclay."
"But then," cried Captain Hood, "why do you construct these railroads at all?"
"To enable you to go from Calcutta to Bombay in 60 hours when you are in a hurry."
"I am never in a hurry."
"Ah, well then, you had better take to the Great Trunk Road and walk."
"That is exactly what I intend doing."
"When?"
"When the Colonel will agree to accompany me on a pretty little stroll of 800 or 900 miles across the country."
The colonel smiled, and without speaking again fell into one of the long reveries from which his most intimate friends, among whom were Captain Hood and Banks the engineer, found it difficult to rouse him. I had arrived in India a month previously, having journeyed by the Great Indian Peninsular Railway, which runs from Bombay to Calcutta via Allahabad. I knew literally nothing of the country, but it was my purpose to travel through its northern districts beyond the Ganges, to visit its great cities, to examine and study the principal monuments of antiquity, and to devote to my explorations sufficient time to render them complete. I had become acquainted with the engineer Banks in Paris. For some years we had been united by a friendship which only increased with greater intimacy. I had promised to visit him at Calcutta as soon as the completion of that part of the Sind, Punjab, and Delhi Railroad, of which he was engineer, should set him at liberty. The works being now at an end, Banks had some months' leave, and I had come to propose that he should take rest by roaming over India with me. As a matter of course, he had accepted my proposal with enthusiasm, and in a few weeks, when the season would be favorable, we were to set off. On my arrival at Calcutta in the month of March, 1867, Banks had introduced me to one of his gallant comrades, Captain Hood, and afterwards to his friend Colonel Munro, at whose house we were spending the evening. The colonel, at this time a man of about 47, occupied a house in the European quarter. It stood somewhat apart, and consequently beyond the noise and stir of the great metropolis of India, which consists in fact of two cities, one native, the other foreign and commercial. This English quarter is sometimes called the City of Palaces, and certainly it abounds with palaces, if the name is to be applied to every building which can boast of porticos and terraces. Calcutta is a rendezvous for all the orders of architecture which English taste lays under contribution when constructing her colonial capitals. As to the residence of Colonel Munro, it was a simple bungalow, a dwelling of one story raised on a brick basement and having a pointed pyramidal roof. It was surrounded by a veranda supported on light columns. The kitchens, offices, coach-house, stables, and outhouses formed two wings. A garden shaded by fine trees and bounded by a low wall enclosed the whole. The colonel's house was evidently that of a man in easy circumstances. There was a large staff of servants, such as is required in Anglo-Indian families. The furniture and every household arrangement was in the very best taste and style. In everything about the establishment might be traced the hand of an intelligent woman, whose thoughtful care must have originally planned the comforts and conveniences of the home. But at the same time one felt that this woman was there no longer. The management of the household was conducted entirely by an old soldier of the colonel's regiment, who acted as his steward or major domo. Sergeant McNeill was a Scotchman, who had been with him in many campaigns, not merely in his military capacity, but as an attached and devoted personal attendant. He was a man of 45, or thereabouts, of tall and vigorous frame, and manly, well-bearded countenance. Although he had retired from the service when his colonel did, he continued to wear the uniform, and this national costume, together with his martial bearing, bespoke him at once the Highlander and the soldier. Both had left the army in 1860, but instead of returning to the hills and glens of their native land, both had remained in India, and lived at Calcutta in a species of retirement and solitude, which requires to be explained. When my friend Banks was about to introduce me to Colonel Munro, he gave me one piece of advice. "Make no allusion to the Sepoy revolt," he said, "and, above all, never mention the name of Nana Sahib." Colonel Edward Munro belonged to an old Scottish family, whose members had made their mark in the history of former days. He was descended from that Sir Hector Munro who in 1760 commanded the army in Bengal when a serious insurrection had to be quelled. This he effected with a stern and pitiless energy. In one day 28 rebels were blown from the cannon's mouth, a fearful sentence, many times afterwards carried out during the mutiny of 1857. At the period of that great revolt, Colonel Munro was in command of the 93rd Regiment of Highlanders, which he led during the campaign under Sir James Outram, one of the heroes of that war, of whom Sir Charles Napier spoke as the Chevalier Bayard of the Indian Army. Colonel Munro was with him at Cawnpore, and also in the second campaign he was at the siege of Lucknow, and continued with Sir James until the latter was appointed a member of the Council of India at Calcutta. In 1858, Colonel Munro was made a Knight Commander of the Star of India, and was created a baronet. His beloved wife never bore the title of Lady Munro, for she perished at Cawnpore on the 27th June, 1857, in the atrocious massacre perpetrated by the orders and before the eyes of Nana Sahib. Lady Munro, her friends always called her so, had been perfectly adored by her husband. She was scarcely 27 at the time of her terrible death. Mrs. Orr and Miss Jackson, after the taking of Lucknow, were miraculously saved and restored to their husband and father. But to Colonel Munro nothing remained of his wife. She had disappeared with the 200 victims in the well of Cawnpore. Sir Edward, now a desperate man, had but one object remaining in life. It was to quench a burning thirst for vengeance, for justice. The discovery of Nana Sahib, for whom by order of government search was being made in all directions, was his one great desire, his sole aim. It was in order to be free to prosecute this search that he had retired from the army. Sergeant McNeill got his discharge at the same time, and faithfully followed his master. The two men were animated by one hope, lived in one thought, had but one end in view, and eagerly starting in pursuit, followed up one track after another, only to fail as completely as the Anglo-Indian police had done. The Nana escaped all their efforts. After 3 years spent in fruitless attempts, the Colonel and Sergeant McNeill suspended their exertions for a time. Just then the report of Nana Sahib's death was current in India, and this time it seemed to be so well attested as to admit of no reasonable doubt. Sir Edward Munro and McNeill returned to Calcutta, and established themselves in the lonely bungalow which has been described. There the colonel lived in retirement, never left home, read nothing which could contain any reference to the sanguinary time of the mutiny, and seemed to live but for the cherished memory of his wife. Time in no way mitigated his grief. I learned these particulars from my friend Banks, on our way to the house of mourning, as Sir Edward's bungalow might be called. It was very evident why he had warned me against making any allusion to the Sepoy revolt and its cruel chief. It must be noted that a report of Nana's reappearance in Bombay, which had for some days been circulating, had not reached him. Had it done so, he would have been on the move at once. Banks and Captain Hood were tried friends of the colonel's, and they were his only constant visitors. The former, as I have said, had recently completed the works he had in charge on the great Indian Peninsular Railway. He was a man in the prime of life, and was now appointed to take an active part in constructing the Madras Railway, designed to connect the Arabian Sea with the Bay of Bengal, but which was not to be commenced for a year. He was just now on leave at Calcutta, occupied with many mechanical projects, for his mind was active and fertile, incessantly devising some novel invention. His spare time he devoted to the colonel, whose fast friend he had been for 20 years. Thus most of his evenings were spent in the veranda of the bungalow. There he usually met Captain Hood, who belonged to the first squadron of carabineers, and had served in the campaign of 1857–58, first under Sir John Campbell in Awadh and Rohilkhand, and afterwards in Central India under Sir Hugh Rose, during the campaign which terminated in the taking of Gwalior. Hood was not more than 30. He had spent most of his life in India, and was a distinguished member of the Madras Club. His hair and beard were auburn, and he belonged to an English regiment. Otherwise he was thoroughly Indianized, and loved the country as if it had been his by birth. He thought India the only place worth living in, and there certainly all his tastes were gratified. A soldier by nature and temperament, opportunities for fighting were of constant recurrence. An enthusiastic sportsman, was he not in a land where nature had collected together all the wild animals in creation, all the furred and feathered game of either hemisphere? A determined mountaineer, the magnificent ranges of Tibet offered him the ascent of the loftiest summits on the globe. An intrepid traveler, what debarred him from setting foot on the hitherto untrodden regions of the Himalayan frontier? Madly fond of horse racing, the race courses of India appeared to him fully as important as those of Newmarket or Epsom. On this latter subject Banks and Hood were quite at variance. The engineer took very little interest in the turfy triumphs of Gladiator and Co. One day, when Hood had been urging him to express some opinion on the point, Banks said that to his mind, races could never be really exciting but on one condition.
"And what is that?"
demanded Hood. "It should be clearly understood," returned Banks quite seriously, "that the jockey last at the winning post is to be shot in the saddle."
"Ah, not a bad idea,"
exclaimed Hood very simply, nor would he have hesitated to run the chance himself. Such were Sir Edward Munro's two constant visitors, and without joining in their conversations, he liked to listen to them. Their perpetual discussions and disputes on all sorts of subjects often brought a smile to his lips. One wish and desire these two brave fellows had in common, and that was to induce the colonel to join them in making a journey, and so to vary the melancholy tenor of his thoughts. Several times they had tried to persuade him to go to places frequented during the hot season by the rich dwellers in Calcutta. The colonel was immovable. He had heard of the journey which Banks and I proposed to take. This evening the subject was resumed. Captain Hood's idea was a vast walking tour in the north of India. He objected to railroads, as Banks did to horses. The middle ground proposed was to travel either in carriages or in palanquins, easy enough on the great thoroughfares of Hindustan. "Don't tell me about your bullock wagons and your humped zebu carriages," cried Banks. "I believe if you had your way without us engineers, you would still go about in primitive vehicles such as were discarded in Europe 500 years ago.
I'm sure they are far more comfortable than some of your contrivances, Banks. And think of those splendid white bullocks. Why, they keep up a gallop admirably, and you find relays at every 2 leagues.
Yes, and they drag a machine on 4 wheels after them, in which one is tossed and pitched worse than in a boat at sea in a storm.
Well, I can't say much for these conveyances, certainly, answered Hood. But have we not capital carriages for 2, 3, or 4 horses, which in speed can rival some of your trains? For my part, give me a palanquin rather than a train.
A palanquin, Hood? Call it a coffin, a bier, where you are laid out like a corpse.
That's all very well, but at least you are not rattled and shaken about. In a palanquin you may write, read, or sleep at your ease, without being roused up for your ticket at every station. A palanquin carried by 4 or 6 Bengali gamals, or bearers, will take you at the rate of 4.5 miles an hour, and ever so much safer, too, than your merciless express trains.
The best plan of all, said I, would certainly be to carry one's house with one. Oh, you snail, cried Banks. My friend, replied I, a snail who could leave his shell and return to it at pleasure would not be badly off. To travel in one's own house, a rolling house, will probably be the climax of inventions in the matter of journeying.
Perhaps it will,
said Colonel Munro, who had not yet spoken.
If the scene could be changed without leaving home and all its associations, if the horizon, points of view, atmosphere and climate could be varied while one's daily life went on as usual, perhaps—
No more travellers' bungalows,
said Hood,
where comfort is unknown, although for stopping there you require a leave from the local magistrate.
No more detestable inns in which one is fleeced morally and physically, said I.
What a vision of delight,
cried Captain Hood.
Fancy, stopping when you please, setting off when you feel inclined, going at a foot's pace when disposed to linger, racing away at a gallop the instant the humour strikes you. Then to carry with you not only a bedroom, but drawing and dining and smoking rooms, and a kitchen, and to cook. That would be something like progress indeed, Banks, and 100 times better than railways. Contradict me if you dare.
Far from contradicting, I should entirely agree with you, if only you carried your notion of improvement far enough.
What? Do you mean to say better still might be done?
Listen, and judge for yourself. You consider that a moving house would be superior to a carriage, to a saloon carriage, even to a sleeping car on a railroad. And supposing one travelled for pleasure only, and not on business, you are right. I suppose we are agreed as to that?
Yes, said I, we all think so.
And Colonel Munro made a sign of acquiescence. Well, continued Banks, now let us proceed. You give your orders to your coach-builder and architect combined, who turns you out a perfect realization of the idea, and there you have your rolling house, answering in every way to your requirements, replete with every convenience and comfort, not so high as to make one fear a somersault, not so broad as to suggest the possibility of sticking in a narrow road, well hung, in short, perfection. Let us suppose it has been built for our friend Colonel Munro. He invites us to share his hospitality, and proposes to visit the northern parts of India, like snails, if you please, but snails who are not glued by the tail to their shells. All is prepared, nothing forgotten, not even the precious cook and kitchen so dear to our friend Hood. The day for starting comes. All right. Halloa! Who is to draw your house, my good friend?
Draw it?
cried Hood.
Why, mules, asses, horses, bullocks.
In dozens, said Banks.
Ah, Let's see. Elephants, of course! Elephants! It would be something superb, majestic, to see a house drawn by a team of elephants, well matched and with splendid action. Can you conceive a more lordly and magnificent style of progression? Would it not be glorious?
Well, yes, but...
But still another of your buts.
And a very big but it is.
Bother you, engineers. You are good for nothing but to discover difficulties.
And to surmount them when not insurmountable, replied Banks quietly.
Well then, surmount this one.
I will, and in this way. My dear Monroe, Captain Hood offers us a large choice of motive power, but none which is incapable of fatigue, none which will not on occasion prove restive or obstinate, and, above all, require to eat. It follows that the travelling house we speak of is quite impracticable, unless it can be a steam house.
And run upon rails, of course. I thought so,
cried the captain, shrugging his shoulders. No, upon roads, returned Banks, drawn by a first-rate traction engine.
Bravo!
shouted Hood.
Bravo! Provided the house need not follow your imperious lines of rails, I agree to the steam.
But, said I to Banks, an engine requires food as much as mules, asses, horses, bullocks, or elephants do, and for want of it will come to a standstill. A steam horse, replied he, is equal in strength to several real horses, and the power may be indefinitely increased. The steam horse is subject neither to fatigue nor to sickness. In all latitudes, through all weathers, in sunshine, rain, or snow, he continues his unwearied course. He fears not the attack of wild beasts, the bite of serpents, nor the stings of venomous insects. Desiring neither rest nor sleep, he needs no whip, spur, or goad. The steam horse, provided only he is not required at last to be cooked for dinner, is superior to every draught animal which Providence has placed at the disposal of mankind. All he consumes is a little oil, or grease, a little coal, or wood, and you know, my friends, that forests are not scarce in our Indian peninsula, and the wood belongs to everybody.
Well said,
exclaimed Captain Hood.
Hurrah for the steam horse! I can almost fancy I see the travelling house, invented by Banks the great engineer, travelling the highways and byways of India, penetrating jungles, plunging through forests, venturing even into the haunts of lions, tigers, bears, panthers, and leopards, while we, safe within its walls, are dealing destruction on all and sundry. Ah, Banks, it makes my mouth water. I wish I wasn't going to be born for another 50 years.
Why not, my dear fellow?
Because 50 years hence your dream will come true. We shall have the steam house.
It is ready now, said Banks simply.
Ready? Who has made one? Have you?
I have, and to tell you the truth, I rather expect it will even surpass your visionary hopes.
My dear Banks, let's be off at once,
cried Hood, as if he had received an electric shock. The engineer begged him to be calm, and turning to Sir Edward Monroe, addressed him in an earnest tone. Edward, said he, if I place a steam-house at your command, if a month hence, when the season will be suitable, I come and tell you that your rooms are prepared, and that you can occupy them and go wherever you like, while your friends, Mauclay, Hood, and I, are ready and willing to accompany you on an excursion to the north of India, will you answer me? Let us start, Banks, let us start, and the God of the traveller be our speed?
Aye, my friends,
replied Colonel Monroe, after a few moments' reflection.
Aye, I agree. I place at your disposal, Banks, the requisite funds. Keep your promise. Bring to us this ideal of a steam house, which is to surpass even Hood's imagination, and we will travel over all India."
"Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!"
shouted Captain Hood.
"Now for wild sport on the frontiers of Nepal."
At this moment Sergeant McNeil, attracted by the captain's ringing cheers, appeared at the entrance to the veranda.
"McNeil,"
said Colonel Munro,
"we start in a month for the north of India. Will you go?"
"Certainly, Colonel, if you do,"
he replied. End of Book 1, Chapter 2.